Antonioli. I'm the CEO of Verra, and we're very delighted to be hosting this event, this session on why and how to engage in carbon markets. Clearly, the question is being asked by a lot of companies trying to figure out whether they engage in carbon markets and how they use them. And yesterday, there was an interesting announcement in the press about Tottenham Hotspur having the first net zero carbon football match in September 19th. If any of you in London want to go, but it's an interesting announcement because they're saying they're trying to reduce the emissions as much as possible related to the event by promoting mass transit, biking to the game, alternative food or non-meat based diets to reduce carbon footprint, and a number of other measures. And they're also investing in a few projects to compensate for the residual footprint. So it's a good example of how this is starting to bear on companies, and in this case, teams, figuring out what the pathway or what this journey looks like in terms of addressing your carbon footprint. So it's a good framer of that. And we've got a great panel today. Really, we have everybody kind of along the supply chain of carbon markets, except for the very end, kind of the end buyers, but we can leave that as a side because I think the folks we have here on the panel are really instrumental in helping to answer the question or providing some insights into how exactly, whether and how you engage in carbon markets. So I'm going to start to describe what that ecosystem looks like, starting with Sandeep Choudhury, who's the CEO and president of V&V Advisory. They develop carbon projects. So they basically have good ideas in mind for project activities that can turn into projects that can demonstrate that they are reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And I'll let each one of them introduce themselves as we get along. But Sandeep represents kind of the project developer side of things. And of course, when Sandeep or the folks in that space want to develop a project, they need to have a system or a set of rules and procedures that they follow in order to make sure that the carbon credits that they generate have value. And for that, we have Baroody from Verra, who's a senior director with Verra, and Julie's job and Verra's job is really to provide the standards and the greenhouse gas crediting program rules and procedures that projects have to go through. Now, once they've gone through that, you've got a carbon credit that you can actually sell in the market. It's got value because it's gone through a process. And then we have Jonathan Shopley, who represents Natural Capital Partners, who are kind of one of those core players in the market who help build it together and kind of provide a very critical intermediary role where they're linking corporate buyers with the projects themselves, helping them to understand what their preferences are, what their footprint is, and then how they actually go about purchasing and retiring credits. And Angela Foster-Rice represents Everland, that also is kind of an intermediary, but very focused on REDD+, or reducing emissions from avoided deforestation, forest degradation, and forest enhancement. So they have a number of projects that are out there looking at, looking to preserve forests and generate these carbon credits that they can then sell on to their clients. So we have a great part of the spectrum here. And so to start us off, I wanted to have share a poll question with everybody, just to get a sense as to where everybody lands in terms of the idea of what carbon markets are, and really in respect of climate change, are carbon markets one of these following things? So if you could please put that on the screen. Let's see when we see it up here. I don't see it yet, but you'll see it soon enough. But really, we're asking you to opine on whether you think carbon markets are the total solution to climate change. Are they partial solution to climate change? Or are they distraction from addressing climate change? And so we wanted to get a sense from the audience as to where you guys landing, so we can help inform the conversation. Let's see, I'm not seeing it yet. Hopefully you guys are seeing it. Warren, can you help us out here to make sure the poll is up here? If we don't get it soon, we may have to move ahead and proceed with our original plan?
The poll is live, David. Just to
Oh, it is.
you know, yeah, the poll is live, yeah, and the votes are still coming in. I mean, it's only just really started, yeah, but we've got a partial solution is 92.6%.
Okay, great. Well, that's good to know. Great.
Zero a distraction, and the total solution at 7.4%.
Interesting. I would have thought that we got a higher percentage of folks who said that it's a distraction. So that's great. That's very informative. Thank you, Warren. Why don't we move ahead? And if you could flash the results, that would be helpful. But otherwise, let me start with the first question to you. And maybe when I first introduce you guys, if you can just say a little bit about your role in the market. I already described it a little bit, but maybe provide us a bit more insight so that the audience can understand where you're coming from. But finance for nature-based solutions, forestry, biodiversity, can come from a number of sources, whether it's multilateral funding, whether it's funding through the Green Climate Fund and other types of funding. But here we're talking about finance for these activities coming from the carbon market, which is largely driven by the private sector. Why is it that we should embrace that? Or why is it that this is now even just a discussion topic? Because I would imagine that 10 years ago, most people really wouldn't have thought that the private sector could be a force for conserving forests. But Sandeep, I'll let you take a crack at it first.
Yeah, thanks, David. I think I would actually take it one notch ahead and say I think carbon markets provide or have the potential to provide better and more finance than the public finance. And I would back that up with basically number one is the accountability part. When was the last time we saw any bilateral sue a government for not delivering results? And in the carbon markets, we are accountable for the delivery of credits as project developers. And there lies in liability. And I think that's something that's a shift from public finance, because public finance, in my opinion, and for whatever I've seen in the last decade, is that public finance is largely unaccountable. When Norway gave all that money to Brazil for conservation and things didn't pan out the way it did, what was the legal liability for that? As project developers, we have to. So for me, it's the purest form of result-based financing that exists today. And that's not just because I'm part of the markets. If you look at it logically, carbon finance is not a debt product. It's not an equity product. It seamlessly fits into all kinds of blended finance instruments, be it insurance, be it microfinance, be it all kinds of instruments that actually go towards forest and biodiversity space. We talk about biodiversity, we talk about non-timber forest produce, supply chains, et cetera, et cetera. All of these financing mechanisms can be blended in with carbon, and you can really scale. And and that's where I come from. And I think if you're unlocking capital to the extent that if you look at our net zero pledges, okay, let's just look at one pledge, the top 100 climate pledge, let's say, that is talking about companies with annual revenues of 1.5 trillion plus. Even if we unlock a small percentage of that, that will top public finance on biodiversity quite easily, in my opinion. And I'm just talking about 100 companies. In the UK, I think about 50% of FTSE companies are pledged to net zero. Put that all together, and I'm from Asia. A lot of Asian companies are going down that road of net zero claims, pledges in 2030, 2040, which is much ahead of time of the Paris goals. So in my opinion, if we unlock all of that and give unrestricted access to the private sector to invest in forests and in biodiversity with the carbon markets, it will unleash, I think, a lot more action on the ground, and it's more agile. We talk about public finance. Public finance is slow. I mean, anybody on this panel and in the audience has to agree to that. The fiduciary requirements are very, very high. And a lot of public finance first goes through the public funding channels and then reaches communities. And by then you've already taken in a lot of admin expenses and so on and so forth. So this is direct finance that can go to projects, can go to forests, and at a scale which I think would trump any other form of financing, David. That would be my 2 cents on this. Yeah, and this, yeah, I mean, the one is scale, and the number 2 is agility. Agility is really important because we're running out of time. We need to deploy capital quickly, and that's what the private sector wants. Because my pledges, my targets, we want anybody in the private sector wants emission reductions quickly and avoidance quickly. And it's in their interest to get it done and get it done fast and keep the wheels rolling. So that's where I come in with the public versus private. So in my opinion, I think it trumps any other form of finance, and it can blend in very nicely with other forms of finance. Yeah.
Thank you, Sandeep. That's very, very helpful and very thoughtful. A question though, and maybe happy to let others opine on this. You know, in the end of the day, if you invest in a project, that's great. You can get money flowing quickly, but you're offsetting an existing emission. So maybe back to our poll question, you know, the majority said that it's a partial solution. If all we're doing is offsetting existing emissions, we're not going to get to the target set out in the Paris Agreement. So what is it about carbon markets that actually makes them work? And in what context do they need to operate in order to really have a true impact?
I'd be happy to take this question. My name is Julie Baroody. As David said, I'm Senior Director of Forest Carbon Innovations at Verra. My role is to coordinate a fantastic cross-organizational team that is charged with ensuring the success of projects and programs using the Verified Carbon Standard. And so, as David often says, at Verra, we create rules that nobody likes, but everybody can live with. And that gets to the core of the issues that we're talking about here today. So to go to the question, carbon crediting is great. We definitely need the market-driven finance and innovations that Sandeep was pointing to. However, they aren't totally the answer to climate change. They need to be used as part of an integrated approach that involves government and corporate actions in reducing emissions. So carbon crediting must be supported by government policies that incentivize decarbonization and low carbon development. But companies have a large role to play because they first must plan how they're going to abate their own emissions in alignment with a 1.5 degree pathway. And then they can use carbon credits to offset what they can't yet address. So they should always be communicating transparently about what kind of actions they're taking, and using clear claims about their commitments and achievements. What kind of carbon credits are they using? Where are those carbon credits from? Are they from nature-based solutions? Are they from industrial activities? And how do they compare with the actions that they're taking themselves? So I agree with everybody in this session that carbon credits have a key role to play, but they need to be placed in the context of a mitigation hierarchy that starts with own actions to reduce climate change.
So Angela and Jonathan, maybe I'll turn to you guys. Thank you, Julie. That was very helpful and good to frame how carbon credits can really make a difference, right? If you end up complementing internal reductions with fast and agile financing, you can really make a difference. But you know, from your perspectives, Angela or Jonathan, who are working with clients, you know, how does that work? And how do you make sure that there is real action behind, you know, the purchase of credits?
I'll take a quick crack at that. Yeah, take a quick. Jonathan Shopley, of course, and I'm with Natural Capital Partners. And by way of introduction, been in that business for 20 years, and really used that time to help corporates navigate carbon markets in order to achieve their sustainability and climate objectives over that period. And my role is on the external affairs aspect. So in other words, to look at what the market is able to deliver to corporates by way of quality, integrity, and ambition. So I'll just speak to that, David, because I think your question relates to the interplay of those three concepts that Julie and Sandeep have spoken about. You know, we in the early days, 20 years ago, there was no real declared ambition around climate, but then we got the Paris Agreement, with the IPCC reports. We're talking about a 1.5 degree target, and we've got everybody involved, every country and ideally every corporate. But the Paris Agreement's ambition creates a compelling case for action by all, actually. And then the next piece is, that ambition has been translated into countries' targets, NDCs, nationally determined contributions. There's a sort of a gap. What do corporates do when you're sort of down inside a range of individual countries, your operations are multinational? So then it's about the quality and the integrity of the actions that you take. And if I start off with quality, then the issue is what's an acceptable level of performance against those ambitions? And the Paris accounting is still a little vague. That quality is unevenly spread across all of the actors. NDCs don't yet add up to a total solution to 1.5. But when we get to the corporate level, actually, we find that that's where some of the strongest elements of quality exist. The accounting, the greenhouse gas protocol, and how you measure a footprint is pretty well sorted out. The financial industry's requirements, as expressed by the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, are calling for more and more transparency, key part of quality and integrity. So we can sort of see what's going on a lot more easily within the corporate sector. But the issue, Julie, that you talked about is sort of moves us on to integrity. So you might have people using the markets, but are they using them with integrity? And that means, sort of an honest, strong, moral, principled commitment to that ambition. We need to reduce, in absolute terms, global emissions, in fairly short order. When we start talking about the credibility of markets, I do want to say that, from my perspective, actually, the strongest combination of ambition, quality, and integrity exists at the corporate level, although there are issues that we need to keep an eye on. And that is being able to track, measure and track and report progress towards targets, claims, pledges, and to make sure that what we do, particularly in using instruments, and David, you hinted at that with the football analogy, if you're making a claim of neutrality and that makes people believe that we've solved climate change, the impact of our emissions into the atmosphere, the reality is that we're still emitting, but we are compensating for those emissions. So as we get closer to the atmospheric capacity to hold more greenhouse gases, we need to be very open and honest and operate with integrity and make sure we use markets in a way that when we add up all of the corporate actions, all the national actions, that we are indeed targeting and delivering on the 1.5 ambition. So I'll stop there. That
thank you,
some way
Jonathan.
answered your question.
Yeah, no, thank you. And aside, I forgot to mention that there's a chat box. Please, for the audience, please drop in your questions in there because we want to get to them. But I did want to pick up on one of them that's already asked. And the question is, where do you draw the line between what a company can do and when the use of carbon credits are justified? Is this a technical or economic boundary issue or something else? Who determines that and how is that called? Angela, I'm going to give you a chance to respond if you want. Otherwise, yeah, go ahead.
Sure. So Angela Foster-Rice, I'm with Everland, and Everland partners with forest communities that are working to protect their forests with companies that are looking to offset their emissions. And so we help to put them together and help fund that work. And historically, I'm an environmental attorney, and I was at United for 15 years leading on sustainability and climate policy. So just a little bit of my background. So just in thinking about, what can we do with companies, and they look, how do we judge their, what they've done, their actions are being taken. I mean, it's this really is, it's being developed, a bit around, broader policy. You see that in, different governments are trying to think that through, but really the biggest place that's coming in is in third party, international bodies that are developing, like the SBTI or the Task Force on Scaling the Voluntary Carbon Market, but even more so recently, what's called the VCMI, the Voluntary Carbon Integrity Initiative. And so that's a space that's looking directly at this issue. And so you see these different bodies coming up with, what do we think companies should be able to say? Because, the whole goal is you don't want to decrease the ambition. You don't want to stop companies from doing everything they can to both get their emissions down and to go outside their industry and use all the tools in the climate mitigation toolbox, which means reducing emissions outside their industry. So you want both those things to happen. They do reflect slightly different activities. I mean, clearly, if you're directly reducing your emissions versus helping somewhere else, but how do we define that better and what kind of claim? So that's actually a space that's evolving, and there are these different bodies that are trying to define it. And I think what I would just say is climate change leaders need to continue to push forward and do what they think is right and engaging, and all these different policies are going to start to fall together. But it is a space that is evolving, and people have different opinions. There's also, you often hear these words like net zero and climate neutrality. Net zero is looking at that 2050, all the world coming together and getting to that carbon neutrality in 2050, and then carbon neutrality is really the year to year. Either it's getting all your emissions down and purchasing offsets to completely neutralize your carbon emissions on an annual basis. With that, I'll pass the mic back to you, David.
Thank you, Angela.
David, could I just add, may I add a little bit,
Sure.
just a quick thing? Angela is so right that there are many, many terms, and some are being used with integrity and some may not be. But what's interesting to me is that, ISO is now working on a carbon neutrality standard. The SBTI is working on a net zero standard. So our expectation is that there are going to be environmental NGOs and civil society that will set a very high bar for integrity and what constitutes an adequate amount of abatement before you start using external instruments to meet a target. But out of that, I think, will all of the innovation that has been delivered by the voluntary carbon market over the last 15, 20 years is being sort of consolidated into much clearer, crisper guidance that people can turn to, third-party reference points. But I think, Angela, as you've mentioned, particularly with the VCMI, the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, there's a lot of qualitative interpretation, and it is quite political as to decide how much pain you take internally before you use external opportunities and the like. Thanks.
No, thank you. Thank you both. Those were very helpful. And I think it's really important to recognize that, the term that's being used a lot today is net zero. But net zero is the way someone explained it to me made a lot of sense. It's an end state, right? It's once all of the reductions have happened internally and we're at a point where we need to be basically removing carbon from the atmosphere. That's 20, 30 years down the line, and we're kind of all of the offsets are actually being developed in kind of removals projects. But between now and then, there's a huge opportunity to stop forests from being cut down and ending up in the atmosphere, et cetera. So that's very helpful. Thank you. I did want to pick up one question because I want to make sure we cover this because I know it's something there was a question about it, which is about the quality of the credits. Maybe Julie, this might go back to you. And the question is, actually the carbon credits available in the carbon market are all verified credits. That's true. But how you define quality among all the verified credits? I know that there's been some, there's some concerns about that. Maybe if you as a standard setting body, can you speak to that?
Sure. So I thanks for this question. I appreciate people trying to tell the difference between all of the different credits out there. So I'd like to say that, start by saying that programs like the Verified Carbon Standard issue credits using rigorous methodologies. We use third-party expert auditing, and we have registries that prevent double counting. So those are some of the core carbon values that we think that all credits should have. But there are others. So you could rate all carbon credits should be additional, which means that they wouldn't have happened without in the business as usual scenario. They need to be real, which means they're accounted for using rigorous methodologies and against rigorous standards. They need to be permanent. So they need to not be able to be reversed or emitted to the atmosphere or unlocked before their time. And so those are all the core carbon values that we not all of them, but there's some of the core carbon values that the task force for scaling the voluntary carbon markets has set out, and that Verra, all Verra credits or all VCS credits are evaluated too by a third party.
Great, thank you. Jonathan, please.
I just want to say that, Verra has definitely provided the lead, in the forestry and biodiversity space, and is highly respected. And I think, I can say this for you, is the most used standard. But, this is the voluntary carbon market. It is self-regulated, or has been self-regulated by ICROA, the International Carbon Reduction and Offset Alliance, which has actually looked very carefully at the range of standards that are out there and approved Verra and others for ACR, gold standard, CAR, amongst them, as being of high quality, to answer your question. Thanks, David.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe I want to turn to you, Sandeep. And there was a question here, and maybe I want to clarify what I meant by kind of net zero being a state in the future. I think what we're saying here, but maybe Sandeep, you can kind of emphasize this, is that carbon markets today can make a real big impact. And the question is, do you really believe in programs that target 2050? What can we do now that is urgent and work on carbon credits? And maybe the other question related to that is, how do we bring to scale carbon markets in developing countries? What are the barriers and how to overcome them? But maybe Sandeep, as a project developer, I'd be curious to hear your take on this, but also maybe open it up to the broader group in terms of what's happening in the voluntary carbon market that's actually helping us to reach that scale that we need.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll take the second question first in terms of what can scale carbon markets in the developing countries. One is to have no forms of restrictions, because right now we do have a bit of murkiness around in terms of what constitutes a good carbon credit, whether our money is safe, et cetera, et cetera. So I think if we can roll back time and go back to 2017 and bring back the bring the investments that we have in 2021 is the ideal scenario, because I think in between we have things about accounting, claims, et cetera. I always believe that it's a demand side problem, should be tackled at the demand side, not to bring it to the supply side. If there is a problem with the integrity of the claim, that should be solved at the claim end, not at the supply end. And that's a very important thing to understand in order to really scale action in the developing countries. So that's number one. And I think there has been an attempt in the past year or so to put that onus down to the developer part, and that is detrimental, I think, in accelerating climate action. So that's number one for you. And David, what was your first question again? If I have a hazy thing on that.
Wait, now you're challenging me. See if I remember my own question. I think my question was about how do we bring scale to carbon markets, and what are some of the new developments in the voluntary carbon market that you see that are exciting, or maybe even from the other side, what are some of the challenges that you're seeing in terms of to be able to get to investments at scale?
Investments at scale. I mean, right now there are investment interest at scale, but with the caveat on whether my claim stands, 10 years later or 15 years later. These are all long-term investments. And I think now I get the first question was, is offsetting better than having these long-term 2050 net zero? I couldn't agree more, because I really think that action now is what offset markets gives you. As much as we like the whole concept of internal reduction, because internal reduction is going to take time, and offsets are something that's real action right now. And we need that for a 1.5, 2 or 3 or whatever realistically we are looking at, really. So I think offsets really, really help. Internal reductions are not going to cut it, because there is an element of climate justice here. And I keep coming back to this, because the private sector also has a role to play in this. When we say that, if Amazon, and for lack of a better example, reduces all their emissions of their manufacturing plants, that might not solve the problem of climate justice and vulnerability that we have. Offsets money really addresses the vulnerable outside your boundaries. And today, boundaries are not in your district or in your province, it's across the world, right? So that's where I think offsets play a massive role. It's not just about climate, it's about people as well. So that's where I think it's a more equitable way of dealing with climate change, instead of just focusing on internal reductions, because that's not going to help in the long run, because the global south needs the support of the global north. If governments are not going to provide it, the private sector will have to provide it. And they are willing to do it at scale, but we need to make it as easy as it can get. Yes, with integrity. Bad apples are there everywhere. We need to weed them out. With integrity of the emission reduction and standards like yours. I mean, I'm a project developer developing projects to your standard. I can say with safe thing, it's fairly rigorous. And I would say that we're doing it for a decade and a half now. It's quite rigorous. You know, it's not easy to develop a project, right? So that would mean there's a fair amount of integrity at the emission reduction level. Now, the integrity on the claim side needs to be handled at the claim side. And that's how he will unlock finance, as far as I'm concerned, and not just concentrate on this internal reduction. I like the concept of it, but there is a concept of immediate action for the vulnerable, which the offsets get to you. And, you know, I mean, and developing countries have a lot of people who depend on forest ecosystems and a large population, you know, and we talk about around 35% of the world's global south population depends on forest resources. That's a massive amount of people. Right. So that's where I think offsets really fit into the finance angle, to the sustainable development angle, to the climate justice angle. And that's why the focus is short term right now. Within the next 15 years, you can be transformational. Let's not wait till 2050. So that's where I think the first part of your question comes in there.
Thank you. I was going to turn to Angela. I see you have your hand up, and I was going to turn to you because you market and promote projects that are working with communities and really, in many ways, fighting the climate justice fight. Can you speak a little bit to that and kind of share your perspectives on why that's important, or any other facets? I think your perspective will be really useful.
Yes, absolutely. So, I think if we think about, well, first, just a step back a little bit on the why offsetting, if I could, just your initial part of that, like why now, and then I will get into the EJ and environmental justice piece of it. But a reminder that, deforestation is the second largest cause of human-induced carbon emissions, and only 3% of financing is going towards nature-based solutions. We're losing about the size of Portugal every year, and 2020 had an increase in deforestation levels. So, and we're also told the next 10 years in particular will be crucial to get emissions down if we want to avoid some of the worst impacts of climate change. So there's this necessity to scale and protect forests that isn't being done in other ways. And what offsetting allows companies to do is to take that action that's needed in the short term while they are working on their longer term development and rollout of technology. So we need both, but there's a time issue, and that's crucial. So climate leaders recognize that they need to do something now to get those emissions down globally. In terms of how this factors into the environmental justice aspects, so these forests that are being degraded, they're as Sandeep was saying, the people rely upon these forests, and how do you really change and protect forests is to push back on the economic drivers that's leading to deforestation. So if you work boots on the ground with the communities, you create different economic drivers for them personally and commit them personally, and look in a particular community as to what's the drivers there. Why is deforestation happening in this particular forest? What does the community need? Is it water quality? Is it education? Is it health? Like what is causing, in addition to the direct drivers, the indirect drivers for that activity? And truly the only way that we will stop deforestation is actually to have social change. And that doesn't happen in an office somewhere. It happens on the ground and with the people that are impacted. And that is, so again, I'll also mention around environmental justice aspect is, I will comment on a lot of the decision-making around the rules of engagement in the voluntary carbon markets is not including the communities that are most impacted. So that's another piece of the puzzle, is trying to figure out how to connect those that are local and are directly impacted towards the rules that are being made. So on that, I know I covered a lot of different pieces. Oh, wait, one last part of your question was, what are you seeing that's exciting? And I would say it's the level of corporate ambition and the number of companies that are standing up to say, I'm going to do this. I'm going to help protect these forests, not just both the forests, the projects that exist today, and also committing to long-term purchases for the pipeline of projects that are coming on. And that is just absolutely incredible to see the scale that is just starting to happen. And I feel like we really have turned a page.
Great, thank you.
David,
maybe I want to
add, sorry, I just wanted to
Go ahead,
add,
Sandeep.
Angela, sorry. And that was the most exciting part, actually. There is, I think, more finance today in the markets than there ever was. And I'm talking about the last 15 years for nature-based solutions. I can safely say that. What I missed, and probably something I wanted to touch upon, is the caveat of at the project development side. While there are challenges, there are also challenges on the project development side, is transparency. And I think there needs to be more transparency at the project development level with communities, because we've seen historically where projects go wrong, and that actually comes back to the integrity of the emission reduction or the avoidance, is how are communities engaged on the financial process of the projects. For the longest time, we've seen that the communities have no idea about pricing, margins, so this whole thing about financing also needs to take in consideration fair benefit sharing mechanisms, transparency on the actual financial models, because I think it'll be better served for the corporate as well as all the players in the carbon space to work with more transparency at the community level for long-term sustainability of the projects, because some of these projects, we talk about FPICs and prior consent and all, they span generations. A 2-year-old in 15 years is going to be 17 years old. And a project crediting period is 30 years. So you have to take all of that into picture. Fair pricing, fair benefit share mechanisms, transparency across the supply chain is essential to actually scaling up voluntary action in the forestry and land use space. I mean, that's the point I wanted to make, David. Thanks.
Thank you, Sandeep. So I want to pick up on a question maybe related a little bit to, I'll read it out loud directly, which is, a key challenge to growth in carbon markets is upfront costs of identifying and developing promising carbon projects, conducting carbon quantification studies, et cetera. So at what point do panelists see corporates engaging in the development of these projects? So is it like, oh, I need to offset my footprint, so I want to buy some credits that are already existing? Or do you see more corporates moving upstream and starting to do investment in underlying project, maybe even pre-investment? How would you, I mean, I take it we've got some companies wondering, boy, I'm going to need some carbon credits. How do I engage in this market? And what would you recommend? Any of you, please. Who would like to? Jonathan, please.
David, I think that, in answer, at what point do panelists see corporates engaging? They're already engaged. One of the clients that we've worked with is Betty's and Taylor's and their Yorkshire Tea, and they had a 10-year forward contract on credits. But increasingly, and it goes back to your question about net zero and sort of neutrality along the way, a lot of corporates are aligning their long-term pledges to net zero with investments upfront in projects that will ultimately deliver instruments and credits for retirement, so that when they get to the net zero, they have exactly what they need. And one other critical point, in the why in our title for this session, why and how to engage with carbon markets. One of the reasons why we're getting a massive scale up in finance as markets begin to mature and take root is the fact that an organization or corporate investing in a project may get excess credits, may want to commercialize the credits that they don't need to use. The liquidity that we will have in a scaled up carbon market allows different investors with different risk profiles to take positions in the market and really bring climate finance to bear. And it's the final corporate that does the retirement, of course, that creates the demand. But along the way, there are plenty of opportunities for those with capital to engage with the market, knowing that they will have a liquid, deep market and be able to liquidate those assets if they need to at a later stage. And that's a very powerful part of the market that we shouldn't forget. Thanks.
Yeah. Angela, Sandeep, anything to add from your perspectives?
Yeah, I mean, I would say yes, because there's a lot of structuring going on right now. We're doing extremely complex structures on forestry-based investments, and when we say pre-investment, it's not just about pre-offtakes. It's blended with equity, it's blended with forest produce, supply chains, et cetera, et cetera. So there's quite a lot of structuring going on, complex financial structures, long-term, 15-year, 20-year structures. And I think we have never seen that before, David. And also, it's not just the corporate buyer who's coming in to invest. We're working with pension funds, family offices. These are new players in the market. I've never seen them invest in projects before. And this is a new phenomenon that's happening, where these are not the end users of these, and they are not traders either. These are actually investment funds which are properly putting in capital at scale into projects, into a portfolio of projects. And that I think is being quite transformational. Earlier, we had offtake agreements that were prepaid for. Right now, we're looking at extremely complex financial structures that are going, which brings me to the first point of liability, accountability, which is really, really high in this market owing to these kind of contractual obligations. This off the shelf, I think is not going to be there for a very long time in the nature space, at least, so.
Great, thank you. Angela?
Yeah, I think Jonathan and Sandeep pretty much covered it. But what I would say is, corporates are engaging a lot of different ways. One way that they can engage is entering into a long-term offtake. I mean, yes, of course, you can engage on the development costs, but when you can, if somebody else comes into the picture and can provide those development costs, a corporate can provide the market security that there is a market, they agree to a long-term offtake, and that way the organization that's providing the development costs knows that there's the market secured. So there's a number of different ways. There are different groups of projects that are being developed, and the opportunity for companies to either engage with a specific project or to engage, as Sandeep was mentioning, like a collection, a portfolio of projects. So I think that the important piece of this is for companies to think through what are their objectives, what are they trying to accomplish, and thinking about how they want to engage. And we have seen some companies and their advisors coming in who aren't as familiar with this, and to be very thoughtful about the community itself. And Sandeep was talking about this, that the benefit sharing that's done. This isn't like you're a regular investment. I mean, companies need to be careful that they don't harm the community, that you really are sharing those benefits. So some of this is done differently than other kinds of investments. I mean, yes, they're going to have a return. They're going to get the credits. They might, financially get other benefits, but they just need to be very thoughtful to make sure that the money really goes to everything that we're trying to do, which is to protect these forests and create social change around these forests.
Great, thank you. Julie, I want to turn back to you. There was a question in the chat earlier about, again, we're talking about engaging in this market, but there was a question about, and you mentioned the Task Force for Scaling Voluntary Markets, but maybe talk a little bit about what they're doing to provide further confidence to the market, and in particular answering the question about at what level does the assessment need to be made in order to be confident that this is actually real?
Yeah, I'll answer that question, but first I just want to speak to the last question about what is exciting about the voluntary carbon market and how it's scaling now. And I really appreciate all the different, for lack of a better phrase, deal structures that are being made for companies to be able to invest earlier in projects, because that provides so much security for project development that enables project developers to engage and this relates to the task force work, because with the task force for scaling voluntary carbon markets, ensuring that there are project or program level, so GHG crediting program level governance. That's what they're proposing to do in their report that was released in July. They want to accredit, for lack of a better phrase, all the different programs for their adherence to these core carbon principles. And so that helps project developers be able to say, okay, I'm using a standard that is approved under the under the task force, and I can then trust the rules and regulations, the rules and requirements of that standard to take more risks in project development and understand and go further and push the boundaries of where I would have thought was too risky before. The company is investing in me because they know that I'm using that standard, and so I can be more aggressive about my agricultural forest or agricultural innovations, land management, which might take a longer time to turn over the amount of return that you would get from a RED project, for example. Or you could invest in, I saw earlier there was a question about agroforestry. So under the VCS, we're developing a new afforestation, reforestation methodology that includes agroforestry, and we may develop some agroforestry specific guidance to support projects, but agroforestry projects take a long time to return significant carbon yields. So we really appreciate the work that the task force is doing to put governance over different standards bodies.
Yeah, and that's a good example of how other markets have threaded that needle, which is really exciting, because what we're seeing is that markets, whether it's compliance markets like in Colombia or in South Africa, they now have a carbon tax, but they allow you to use a carbon credit instead of paying the carbon tax. And they accept the VCS units, the gold standard units, and CDM units. And CORSIA, the Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation, recognizes those three, as well as the Climate Action Reserve, the American Carbon Registry, and a few others. I'm drawing a blank, but that concept is saying, look, there's some high-level principles that programs can meet, and if they demonstrate to us that they meet those, we will then approve them. And then project developers like Sandeep have confidence they can invest in project activities because they know that if they follow the rules that are accepted, they will then have a unit that's recognized in the market, and that's very, very valuable. Maybe just a quick question back to you, maybe a little technical, but I did want to answer it. Maybe you, Angela, or you, Julie, can answer the question about how do you avoid bad incentives or incentivizing countries to deforest in order to increase their baseline. This is kind of a question about baselines, right? And I know there's been some queries about, whether the baselines in forest protection projects are legitimate. Can you answer to? Can you respond to that, either of you?
I will make a general response, and then Angela, maybe you want to get to some specifics or fill in anything that I leave out. But I think that the baselines question is key, and we, as a, I'd like to say that, so historically, the Verified Carbon Standard has approved methodologies that use a reference region approach to setting a baseline. That means that a project's actual deforestation is compared to that of a similar region outside the project area, which reflects the rates and patterns of deforestation previously affecting the project area. However, all GHG crediting programs evolve. And so based on, we're currently in the process of updating many of our forest carbon methodologies to use an allocation approach, where you take all of the deforestation in a jurisdiction and allocate it to projects based on the risk of deforestation to a certain area. So that doesn't make the reference region approach any less good, but it just means that we now understand that forest carbon is moving to a more and more jurisdictional level. So we're updating our requirements to reflect that. And so the programs are always evolving. And for example, another thing related to baselines that we are now consulting on and have already implemented in part of our program is a rule change that shortens the time frame within which baselines need to be recalculated. So this change is intended to ensure that projects apply the latest scientific and technological understanding. So over time, projects evolve, and so do programs.
Great, thank you. Angela, did you want to add anything?
I would just add, and then the comment specifically talked about countries increasing deforestation to have a better, baseline. I just think that's really unrealistic. You know, countries are just battling every day to prevent deforestation. They don't have the financial resources and the, you know, these are vast places, and the threats are enormous. You know, the economic drivers that are causing deforestation are enormous. So, you know, that's not happening. I just want to point that out. And Julie mentioned the changes in how baselines are done. It's really, as time has gone on, we're trying to move to a broader scale and allocate from, you know, these larger areas within countries or you know, provinces within. And you know, the methods are changing, not because they're necessarily more sophisticated, but rather because we need to, in order to scale the carbon market, we just need to have consistency and alignment across a jurisdiction. You'll lose some of the granularity, clearly, that you get when you look at a project level and really understanding what's causing deforestation and what the, you know, what led, you know, the creation of the baseline is incredibly detailed. But it's good that we're moving to these jurisdictional approaches and allocating down and nesting in the projects to these structures. I think long term that's very good, but shouldn't be viewed as necessarily more knowledgeable and more sophisticated, but rather just better alignment across a jurisdiction. So I think we're seeing that science is improving. And with it, just like Verra and other standards bodies internationally recognized have done, are continue to update their methodologies based upon the changing science and the changing policy dynamics as well. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. And we'll just one thing quickly. I mean, one good example that I like to use how you prevent this perverse incentive is that, you know, if you want to do a reforestation project, it's not like you can deforest the forest last year, now plant it. There has to be like a historical level of deforestation happening, and that needs to be demonstrated and proven. And this is all kind of what's in the Verra rule book, right? All these things that you have to follow and demonstrate in order to prevent these perverse incentives. But I wanted to turn to something that's very technical, but I think relates a little bit to kind of, we'll have touch points to all of you. And that's the question about, can we move to more streamlined data gathering processes? Really, this is about using satellite imagery, people using smartphones to gather biomass data, and those kinds of technological innovations. And the question really was, I don't have it directly, but it was about how is the carbon market looking at those innovations? Is it embracing them? What does it mean from a project developer's perspective? Sandeep, you know, how do you look at that? Angela, you know, looking at red projects, is that something that is you're encouraging? Do you hear it from your buyers? Jonathan too, how would that impact your work? And of course you, Julie, your perspective in terms of how does it work from a standard setting perspective? Anybody want to take a crack at that?
Let me start taking a crack on that. Yes, I think we are for sure, because, you know, MRV has always been a pain for anybody who's into project development, right? So if anything that can help, aid, you know, make it more credible, I think we're all on for it. For the longest time, it was really expensive, David, to get these solutions down to the ground level. We've been speaking about IoT-based devices and satellite imagery for monitoring DBH, etc., for a while now. It finally seems like it's taking off. We're piloting some in some countries, trying to see what the results look like. But we're also, I mean, you know, you have to be conscious about the fact that communities form a major labor force for us in the projects, and they get direct economical benefits out of that as well as monitoring forces as well. So we need to balance the two. And that's a real problem that we have as well. We don't want to go all technology and no physical activity from day one. You need to slowly phase it out, or maybe have layers around it. But that's something that's quite crucial to us. But yes, I think a short answer would be these technologies are evolving. We're a little worried about how baseline is set and how you actually go around doing all of that, and can that be actually a credible data out there. But I think in the years to come, this will evolve quite a lot. Drone-based, IoT-based sensors, etc., all of them coming in to triangulate the information. I think buyers would like that as well, I would think. So, yeah.
Can I just pick up on your last statement, Sandeep? Buyers. You know, I'm sure people will have noticed that the tech sector, the IT sector, has been big in using instruments, committing to net zero, committing to carbon neutrality. And that's no accident, because digitized approaches, satellite imagery, combined with AI and big data management, give us an incredibly increased efficiency of monitoring large tracts of land under management. And I think that that efficiency is really going to help with the three things that I mentioned in my first intervention around ambition, quality, and integrity, but particularly on transparency and building confidence in the markets. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Julie or Angela, anything to add? Angela.
Yeah, if I may just, I agree with what was said by Sandeep and Jonathan. I would also say, though, that in our effort to try to sit at our desk in another country and be able to observe with accuracy what's happening on the ground in a forest and somewhere else, there are definite limitations. And so we just have to be very thoughtful about that. I mean, one of the pieces is you can't actually see what's happening on the ground. You can't see what the drivers are of deforestation and how they're changing. You can't see that, you know, what's really happening with the people. What are the socioeconomic structures around that forest? So those are things that you can't get with, you know, from your desk. And then also, so I'm by the way, I'm a fan of the development of technology. I don't want anyone to take that away otherwise, but I think there's such a rush. There's such a desire for companies to have the answer. And we're seeing some technology is not quite ready and people want to rely on it, but we have to calibrate it to what's really happening, carefully calibrate. Otherwise it could be used kind of irresponsibly. There must be ground truthing. So I just caution, and some of those remote sensing tools just don't have the right granularity to really to be accurate. So just a word to the wise, because we could end up not giving funding to a project because somebody who uses a tool incorrectly says something about that project, and we end up going 10 steps backward from where we were going and scaling and protecting forests. So just with a real cautionary note, and let's develop these technologies, and once they are developed, we can deploy them.
Julie, maybe that's a perfect tee up for you.
Yeah, just to pick up on what Angela was saying, as a standards body, we are all about making the processes that we have implemented more efficient for project proponents and the investors on the other side. But we do need to maintain the rigor of the carbon credit. And so that's where we're very open to people coming to us with potential uses of technology, even if they are disruptive to our current procedures, as long as they make sense from a standards perspective and from a credit integrity perspective, then we will consider changing our rules even to allow for new approaches. And we're working on some pilots with technology providers right now. However, we need to make sure that the methodology itself is same. And as Angela was saying, we need to make sure that methodologies that are used by these new ratings platforms and things like that are similar to the methodologies that are used by the actual projects. So we have to avoid apples to oranges comparisons.
Great, thank you. So we're here at the top of the hour. It's been a great conversation. I wanted to give you all just a chance to share like a few last words before we go. But you know, we started the session with a poll asking what you all thought about the carbon market, and the vast majority, said that the carbon markets were a partial solution. And I think that makes sense. It's not the only solution, it's not a distraction. I think it's a partial solution. And hopefully we've been able to describe some of the reasons why we think it's a partial solution, namely that it should complement real action internally, but also the promise of carbon markets really is amazing because it can help channel finance to activities today that will help with the climate crisis. But any final thoughts from folks? So even just a few final words about if you had one thing that the audience you'd like to leave them with, what would it be? Sandeep, I'm going to pass it to you.
Keep things simple. Do not overcomplicate things. You know, things will fall into place. Give it time. This is a market that didn't come about, you know, yesterday. This has been around for a decade and more, maybe, you know, 2 decades. So there is a fair level of integrity. Give it a chance and make things as easy as possible on the ground. Deal with all the complications at some other place. let the emission reductions and avoidance happen, because that's the end goal for all of us. So, yeah.
Great, thank you. Julie, we'll go in the same order we started. Julie?
Yeah, I'm just really optimistic about the growth of the potential for nature-based solutions in the voluntary carbon market, and look forward to seeing innovative approaches that result from the growth in the market.
Great. Jonathan?
Yeah, I would add on to all of that, I think we're developing a carbon market here that will be used for voluntary action and compliance action. And I think all the things we've spoken about are so promising in terms of directing finance to things that make a difference today and prop up and provide the credibility to the longer term pledges and commitments that corporates and countries are making. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And Angela, final thoughts.
Yeah, just remember that there's been 15 years of experience in the voluntary carbon market. This didn't start yesterday. What we're doing is building upon that foundation, and we're making it better. But yeah, encourage, and we're seeing climate leaders step up and use the carbon markets to expand their ambition. And I just encourage more to do it. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you to the panel. I think it's been a really interesting panel. Hopefully it answered the question about why and how to engage in carbon markets for a lot of the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.